Welcome back, guys, to Healthy Design Functional Medicine. Thought today we continue talking about kind of how to design a training program. Um, so we'll kind of move on to talking about like Eric Helms and he wrote the book with a couple other people. I don't remember their names. I apologize for that. But it's kind of the pyramid for, hypertrophy, strength, power, that kind of thing. And so again, the base of the pyramid is what we really need to focus on, and then as we move up, those things are less important. And at the base of his pyramid is adherence. So that's one of the biggest things I think people forget is they get caught up in like the number of sets, the number of reps, how many exercises to perform, how to perform the exercise, how often to change things, got to keep the muscle confused, all this kind of stuff, and trying to figure out exactly what's going to be optimal, what's going to be the best way, but not keeping in mind what they can do for it. So I mean, that's where adherence comes in primary. That's the biggest issue. What is it that you can do and do consistently? So adherence is kind of a form of that consistency that I've talked about before. And one of the things too that's kind of real big on that, you can come up with the most scientifically optimal program, blah, 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 blah. But if you don't believe that program's going to work, it's not going to work because you're not going to do it. So you're not going to be adherent to the program. You're not going to do it consistently. So even if, say, something that you believe is going to work is not technically what science says is going to be the best for you, if you believe it's going to work, you're going to put more effort into it, and it's probably going to get you better results than doing that scientifically optimal thing that you don't believe in. And so, we may talk about like transfer of training more for sports at another point, but that's one of the biggest keys. Like people will get results from something that they think is going to work the best for them rather than something that might be scientifically proven to be better for them. And so that belief plays a huge role in things. One, just our psychological plays a huge role in everything. I mentioned in one of my climbing videos that the biggest key for me improving in the grades was believing I could actually climb V8. Until I believed I could actually do it, I couldn't do it. And so the same comes with training. Until you actually believe like this is what's going to work for me, things won't work. So you could have the best program designed, taking into account all the things on this pyramid, but you're like, that's not going to work for me. I'm different, blah, blah, blah. Whatever the case is, you're not going to get the same results from that program rather than one that maybe doesn't take all those things into account, but you believe it's going to work better for you. So that psychological part, that belief plays a big role in things. The other side of it too, if you believe something's going to work for you, you're going to put more effort into it and then you're going to get more results from it. If again, you have the best program in the world, but you put 50% effort into it versus a suboptimal program, but you put 100% into it, that's going to give you more benefit than this one over here. So the other side of adherence just means, again, maybe we come up with this scientifically optimal program, and the best thing for you is to train each muscle group 3 times a week. So that means, 6 days a week of training, or even 7 days, you never get a day off. But yet you've got 2 or 3 days during the week where you just cannot train. It will not work with, work responsibilities, family responsibilities, whatever it is. Then that program's not going to work for you. You can't do that. You can't be adherent to it. You can't be consistent with it. So you'd be much better off doing something where maybe you only work out, 3 times a week, and you can do that consistently. You'll get much better gains from that than doing the other one only once or twice a week, whatever it is, or even 3 times a week. But depending on those days, you're kind of missing certain body parts, certain groups, and things like that. I'm trying to keep things today more related to like hypertrophy and strength rather than sport training. Just because if you're probably training for a sport, you probably need to be listening to people who are talking specifically about that sport. I have some experience in training for climbing and definitely with sprinting too. And so, I mean, I can help with those things. Basketball, that's what I grew up playing. But, as far as trying to get the best results you can out of those sports, you need to listen to someone or talk to someone where that's what they do on a day in, day out basis. This series is kind of more designed for people that are just beginning to weight train and trying to learn some things, and trying to find something that's going to help them to be healthy for the most part, rather than gaining the maximum amount of muscle, the maximum amount of strength, the maximum improvement in sport performance, etc. So adherence is the big thing. If you can't do something, do it consistently. It's not going to give you the results. So we want to come up with something that you can do and you can do consistently over time. That way you'll get the most results from it. The second part, so the second level up on that pyramid, is volume, intensity, and frequency. And so that frequency, is how often you're training a body part. There is research to show that, you can get good results with training a body part one time a week, or you can train a body part more frequently during the week. But a lot of times that's just with the volume being controlled. So, if you are going to train that body part once a week, you're probably going to need more volume in that one workout than you will training that body part 2 or 3 times a week. You'll need less volume in those workouts, but that overall volume is probably going to be about the same. So hopefully that makes sense. So frequency is kind of a way to increase the volume over the week, but not per exercise session or per workout session. The other thing with volume, again, and intensity, we have to be specific with our definitions. I see a lot of people fighting on the internet about volume and intensity, but they're not exactly talking about the same thing. So there's many different ways we can look at volume. We can look at volume as the number of reps, as the number of sets, as the total tonnage listed or lifted during that session. I tend to try to look at it more as kind of like the total number of reps and sets. So it does kind of get along to that tonnage side, but I don't calculate that each workout and see if it's going up. But I know, if I did 2 sets of 10 reps, that's less than doing 2 sets of 12 reps, especially given the weight that's the same, right? So we want to be sure we're talking about the same thing with volume. When it comes to intensity, there's a lot of different ways to talk about that. Some people will talk about intensity in terms of going closer to failure. I do think it's important to go close to failure and get, we don't necessarily need to go to failure each set. I'm not trying to say that. If you've never gone to failure and you're just beginning, do not worry about it. If you're a beginner, you haven't exercised before, you don't need to go to failure. You need to learn how to lift. You need to learn how to lift the right way with good technique. And then you can slowly, over time, as you get that technique ingrained, then you can kind of push it and get close to failure. But, we don't want failure where you're having to do all this kind of crazy stuff to get the weight moving. Then, the likelihood of injury, other things, it just goes up and it's not worth it. So when I'm talking about intensity, I really am referring more to kind of your percent max. So like how close to you are to either that rep max or your 1 rep max. So for instance, let's say like your 1 rep max in a bench press is 100 pounds. Then normally you can do 5 reps or so, maybe, people are different. So again, we're kind of going by averages here, but let's say if we go 80% of that, so 80 pounds on the bench press, you'll probably get somewhere between 4 to 10 reps, depending on who you are. So what we want to do then in that case is that 80%, let's say 8 reps is your max on that, then we want to do at least 7 good reps, 6 good reps where we have 1 or 2 in reserve. If we do that, then we know that the signal was intense enough for that signal to be sent to your muscles to build up stronger, gain size, different things like that. If that 8 rep max is your max with that 80% and you only do 3 reps, you probably didn't send a signal because those 3 reps were pretty easy. So somewhere between 5 and 8 is probably going to be enough to give you some signal to increase and improve. And that's what we're using the weights to do. It's a hormetic stressor. And so that means that the body's going to get that signal, then it's going to build up so that it can handle that stress the next time. That's what we want. We want it to build up, be stronger, and be better than what it was before. Sometimes people refer to intensity as like how fatigued they are afterwards, so how high their heart rate is or how close to vomiting they are or something like that. That doesn't necessarily, that is a form of intensity, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about lifting weights. We really do mean like that either rep max, 5 rep, 8 rep, 10, 12, whatever rep it is, or that percentage of 1 rep max is kind of an easier way. And as that percentage of 1 rep max goes down, the more reps you can do. And so that kind of brings us to this other kind of rule or principle, is that there is a little bit of an inverse relationship between intensity and volume. If you're training super intense, you can also do super amounts of volume. If you're going super intense, you're going to have to do a little bit less on the volume. If the intensity is down some, you can do a little bit more volume to kind of make up for it. And depending on who you are, one of those may give you better results. There's tons of research out there showing that you can do more sets at a lower intensity and get the same amount of growth and strength as doing a higher intensity at a lower volume. But we have to make sure that that mechanical tension, so that intensity, is enough to where it's going to send a signal to our body to improve. From there, I look at the volume as just, that's more of a personal preference kind of thing. There's a certain threshold we have to get with mechanical tension. Once we've met that threshold, then the volume can kind of go up or down based on who we are. Me, for instance, I seem to do pretty well on kind of the lower volume side. I've tried doing higher volumes in the past, and you can see some of my videos, but I don't feel like I was going as close to failure. And I feel like I got some pretty good results with that initially because it was such a difference from what I was doing before. But after doing it for a little while, I felt like the importance became more about doing, more sets or more reps rather than kind of getting that mechanical tension. And I felt like my gains started to kind of stagnate. I don't think they went down, but I think they just kind of plateaued and stayed there. And so now I'm kind of back to doing more of the higher intensity, so a heavier weight, lower rep number, lower set number, and that works well for me. It's what I prefer, it's what I like, it's what I'm going to be more adherent to and be more consistent with, and so that's part of it. I do think changing things up periodically is a good thing, just to give a different stimulus. So, I can only go, and everybody, we can only go so hard for so long, and then we got to take a little bit of a break. And so, what I'll do during my deload weeks, or week or 2 weeks, is that I will decrease the weight, go up on the reps. So, like now, for the most part, I'm doing like 6 to 10 reps. For the heavier workouts, for my depletion workouts, they are higher rep, like 12 to 15. But during those deload weeks, everything's going to be like sets of 12 to 15. But I'll make sure I take good rest times in between, rather than on those depletion workouts where I'm trying to shorten the rest period to deplete glycogen, help out on fat loss, different things like that. The deload week, my goal is to recover. So I want to go a little bit higher, staying a little bit further away from failure because I'm trying to recover. I'm not still really trying to build or anything. I'm just trying to recover from that previous training. And so I think those deload sessions are important for all of us. So keep that in mind, what the goal is. Dan John says, keep the goal the goal. Well, during the deload week or weeks, the goal is to recover. It's not to build muscle. It's not to increase weight. It's not to increase sets or reps or anything else. It's to try to have kind of an easy workout to let your body recover from that previous training that was very stressful. So hopefully that helps out a little bit with the volume and the intensity. There have been different studies that came out. It's been a year or two, I think, for like this 52 sets was people are still getting results doing like 52 sets for quads. Some key things to keep in mind with that study is that they were just doing the 52 sets for quads. They weren't doing 52 sets for chest, for shoulders, for lats, for mid back, for hamstrings, for calves, for delts. I think I already said delts, but for biceps, for triceps, they weren't doing 52 sets of everything. That would just be, in my eyes, way too much. I couldn't recover from that. Maybe there is someone who can. Everybody falls on a spectrum. Some at the lower end of volume, some at the higher end of volume. That's just going to be the way it is. And so that's where we need to play with some of this to figure out what works best for us. But with that study, they kept all the training for the other muscle groups very, very low. And again, I can't imagine doing 52 sets to true failure. That that just sounds miserable. Yesterday I worked out, did upper body. My shoulders are sore. Like side delts and rear delts are sore. Side delts, I only did 2 sets. Now, on the second set, I did do some partials. So, a little bit of an intensity technique to kind of progress things or just to kind of go beyond failure in a sense. For rear delts, I did one direct exercise for rear delts. Granted, I did do some upper body, like back work. So, there's probably some rear delt involvement there. But my shoulders are sore from that very little bit. My lats aren't too bad. Chest, very slightly. Biceps and triceps are, okay. But again, I just basically did 2 sets for biceps, triceps. For lats, I did like 4 sets, and then one for kind of mid back with rows. And I was exhausted after that workout. So I don't know, it was like maybe 20 sets or so total. So I can't imagine doing that again in a few days and then again to kind of get anywhere close to that 52 sets. So what we also need to keep in mind on that too is that, if you're just doing 1 set, it's kind of like your mass and strength kind of improves to here. When you go up to 2, it goes up. It'll keep going up to a certain point in that volume. And, so initially it might be a fairly steep, incline or improvement, but then after a while it starts to level off. And so you may still keep getting some slight benefits by adding, but the benefit you're getting is very, very small, especially in relationship to the amount of work you're having to do for it. And so that's where a cost benefit analysis needs to come in. Like the cost of doing all this for like this 0.2% improvement, is it really worth it? That's something you need to figure out. Again, this is designed, or these talks are designed more for the person who's starting to work out or who's working out lifting weights for health reasons. In that case, I'd say that getting that 0.2%, it's not worth that. Now, if your goal is to be the best bodybuilder in the world, that 0.2%, that might be the difference between you winning and losing a competition. So yeah, in that case, it makes sense. And so, yeah, that's something we have to keep in mind. The next level up, I hope that helps explain volume, intensity, frequency. So let's make sure we have the right definitions first so we can actually discuss things the right way. Because sometimes people are referring just to the tonnage, sometimes people are referring to just the number of sets. But again, if we're doing sets where we're 10 reps short of failure versus sets where we're 1 rep short of failure, are we really comparing the same thing? I don't think we are. But anyway, let's move on. The next level up is progression. We talked a little bit about progression a couple weeks ago. I do like progressive overload. Overload can take a lot of different forms. I do think the simplest and easiest way is to add weight to the bar when you can. This does not mean you have to add weight or reps to the bar every single workout for that body part. But I think we can all agree that, again, we'll go back to that 100-pound bench press example. If you're doing 100 pounds on the bench press for 8 reps today, and then we come back in a year and you're still doing 100 pounds on the bench press for 8 reps, you're probably going to look exactly the same. Now, if you added weight to that when you could, even if it just went up to 120 pounds for 8 reps, you're probably going to look a little bit different than you did a year ago. If you're benching 100 for 8 reps, my guess is you can probably gain a lot more than 20 pounds, especially if you're just starting. But you get my point. Even just a slight bump up is going to make a difference in how you look. If everything stays the same, why should your body do something different? Again, we want that hormetic stress where we send that signal to the body like, hey, we need to be prepared to do this or do more the next time. If we keep doing the same thing over time, we're not sending the signal to the body to build up and be prepared for something even greater the next time. So again, I do think progressive overload over time is important. I think we need to do that, especially when we're talking about for health reasons in a lot of different rep ranges. So lower reps, 5 reps, 10 reps, we want to build up strength in that range over time. We also want to do the same 10 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 30. We want to make sure we're getting stronger gradually over time. And so just add the weight when you can. they have fractional plates. So this brings me up to a little tangent. Um, we think because the plate says 45 pounds, 25 pounds, 35 pounds, 10, 5, 2.5, that that's exactly what it weighs. A lot of people have shown that when you weigh those plates, they're off. So they're not exactly 45. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's less. So if you're in a gym, just try to slowly build up over time. You can't always use the same plates. You won't know because they're going to get moved all around the gym. But just keep that in mind that slowly we're trying to add weight. In that case, fractional plates probably aren't going to make a huge difference because you won't know if you had a weight that, one time that was higher than norm than what it should have been and one that was lower. You can't keep all that straight. I work out on my own in my own home gym. I'm not taking the time to weigh every plate. I don't think it's that important to do, but I can make sure I use the same plates every time since I don't have this extravagant abundance of plates. And so then having fractional plates where it's adding a quarter of a pound on each side, a half a pound on each side, 3/4 of a pound on each side, or 1 pound on each side, it will let me kind of build up slowly because that's one of the big problems with progressive overload is that a lot of times the lowest amount you can add is 5 pounds at a time. The dumbbells I have, the lowest increment I can do is 2.5 pounds. But if we're talking about like a side raise, right now I'm using 40s on that. So 2.5 pounds is over 10%. Well, not quite 10%. 10% would be 4 pounds, but I'm doing that on each side. So I'm getting 5 pounds total out of 80 pounds total. So it's between 5 and 10%. I'm not going to do the math, figure out the exact percentage, but that's a pretty big jump. And so, especially for a small muscle group, let's say I can do 10 reps. If I go up another 2.5 pounds, I might only get 6 reps. It could drop things off that much. Now, if we're doing, 300-pound bench press for 8 reps and we add, you know, 5 pounds to it, it's not going to be that big of a difference. We'll drop some on the reps, but we're probably not going to drop too much. So just keep in mind how much weight you're adding, what percentage that is compared to the weight that you've been using, and just be prepared for those reps to be less. But again, that's fine. The reps are less, but then we can keep doing that exercise and gradually over time, maybe we build up to where, we were doing 6 with it now that we added the weight. Gradually we get back up to the 10 and then we increase the weight again. But I do like the fractional plates because that could be a way to where I could add a smaller progression, like a 2% or 5%, at most increase. That might help to kind of keep those gains going. But again, do I think that's absolutely necessary? No. I think it's kind of fun for the sciencey nerd side of myself to kind of do and see how things go. So that's 3 parts of the pyramid. We'll leave it at that and we'll get to the other 3 next time. Again, we're trying to do all this just to help give you some ideas and how to set up a basic training plan, one that you can adhere to, be consistent with, how to kind of adjust the volume, intensity, frequency. You can make great gains by working out whole body twice a week. If you've never worked out before, even just doing 1 set for 8, 10 different exercises, you will make some rapid and marked improvements. Now, as you get more advanced, so as from going from beginner to intermediate and stuff, just doing 1 set twice a week of 8 to 10 different exercises, it's probably not going to give you the same results anymore. At that point, we may need to progress the volume a little bit. And so again, with the progression, we can do progressive overload with the weight. We can add reps. We can add sets. That's another way to progress. We can shorten rest intervals in between. Some of the progression depends on what it is exactly that you're training. Again, this kind of goes back to that SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand. For training for strength, then we want to make sure we're taking long rest intervals in between, and we're going to really look to kind of keep the reps the same and increase the weight rather than doing more and more reps. We don't necessarily need to get good. If our goal is to lift something 1 time, we don't necessarily need to get really good at lifting it 10 or 15 times. Does that make sense? But maybe you have more of an endurance bent and you want to do that. well, then lifting something one time isn't going to have the same benefit as being able to lift something 10, 15, 30 times, whatever it is. So keep in mind what it is you're looking for and progress kind of that way. Again, when it comes to hypertrophy, it appears that the vast majority of us can make similar improvements from very low rep sets of, like, say, 5 to 8 versus 25 to 30, as long as you're getting close to failure with both of those, probably at failure at that higher end of the rep range rather than the lower end. But I mean, at most, keep like 1 rep in reserve here. Here you might have 1 to 2 in reserve. So again, that's just kind of a very basic plan. Twice a week, 1 set of 8 to 10 exercises. As you progress, maybe add another set, add another set. If you get to where you're doing 3 or 4 sets of everything, I think it'll take you a while to build up to that. I think that's going to give you some continued progress for months, maybe even longer than that. And then we can always change things up. Maybe then you have ways to make more time in your schedule where you can work out more often in the week. Then we can spread things out and stuff too. But again, I think just a very good basic routine to get started is full body 2, maybe 3 times a week if you can swing that. Just pick, just do 1 set of 8 to 10 different exercises that cover the entire body. It's like a vertical push, a vertical pull, horizontal push, horizontal pull, a hip hinge, a squat pattern. So that gives us 6 or 7 right there. And then we can add in like a calf raise, something for shoulders, something directly for arms. You've definitely worked every muscle in your body at that point, and you should get pretty good gains from it, especially if you do that consistently over the long term. So, you don't have to be doing 20, 50 sets per workout and doing that every day of the week. You know, maybe at the very, very high end bodybuilder type level, you need to do that. But for the vast majority of us who are just looking for health, we don't need that amount. And so those types of workouts, you can definitely get in and get out 30, 45 minutes at most. Maybe if you get up to the 3 or 4 sets, it might take a little bit longer. But then we can talk about some other things later, like supersets, et cetera, that could increase the time factor. So, meaning they make it more efficient, that we can get more work done in that same amount of time and get out. So, all right, try not to ramble too much. Hopefully, this is helpful for you guys. Again, like the shirt says, I'm trying to keep things plain and simple. My wife got this for me because that's one of my favorite sayings. I do think a lot of things are plain and simple. We can complicate them as much as we want, but it's better to just keep it plain and simple. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Bye.